We on? Yeah, well, here we are at the climate extinction protest at Marble Arch. And the climate extinction protest is a protest of, young sort of hippie eco types, mostly white, middle-class kids, got a bit of free time and feel strongly about the environment. And it comes in the wake of a protest movement that really has captured the minds of young people and of the news around the world, focused around a young girl, 16-year-old. She's called Greta Thunberg, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and she's from Sweden. And what happened is, last year in the summertime, she went on a protest outside Parliament on her own and was photographed by a company called Time's Up. And Time's Up is a company which she then got a job with as a consultant. I believe that she's resigned from that now because it's become a bit too obvious and people started questioning it. I'm not trying to criticise her motivation. She comes from a family of people who've been involved in World Wildlife Fund and things like that in the past. But what, of course, is true is that someone of that age probably doesn't have that much of a global understanding of, the history of these issues and the political machinations associated with the nature of the system of capitalism that we live under. And so this company that photographed her, called Time's Up, they are an app-making company. They've got backing of 400 major multinational companies who are financing this app to be disseminated through mobile phone downloads onto young people's telephones, and it'll be a sort of a TripAdvisor model. And this TripAdvisor model will allow you to judge and assess people, institutions, companies, based on their valuations of their ecological friendliness or their climate friendliness. And this app is part of a general encroachment and containment and seizure of control over the climate change and environmental agenda by giant multinational corporations who have infiltrated the relationships between them and NGOs, non-government organisations, a multitude of them around the world, which constitute what can be called an NGO industrial complex, which is designed to influence and shape opinion to, one, maintain the organisations themselves, two, provide a lot of jobs for these people who are involved in these NGOs all around the world. I mean, this is a global business from Oxfam to World Wildlife Fund to, various climate change organisations. And what they've done with this particular campaign is first of all, they photographed this Greta Thunberg. Then, because they had a very slick marketing campaign, because they're trying to run a multi-billion-pound app business on the back of this, they then managed to get into all the major mainstream newspapers around the world. So within a couple of days of Greta on her own standing outside Parliament, I mean, just one young girl, suddenly it was world news. And now Greta is going around the world speaking in front of the European Parliament yesterday, for example. She got a standing ovation. And at every meeting, she'll turn around and say, what would you do if your house was on fire? I want you to feel like your house is on fire. And this Extinction Rebellion, the propaganda they've been putting out claims that the world is basically at the final tipping point, and in 12 years' time, unless temperature is reduced and fundamental change is introduced, dramatic and fundamental change, then the world will be destroyed and there'll be no life on Earth or barely any life. The life will be so miserable on Earth that it will be unlivable. And so by creating this, what we can call millenarian concept, a belief that the world is on the edge of total destruction, the young people who demonstrate out of perfectly good motivations are being, in what can only be described as, manipulated by multinational NGOs in conjunction with giant multinational companies like Bill Gates and Melinda Gates. They've got a a charitable organisation which promotes the idea of certain technologies that they're selling. There's a lot of, computer apps and all this sort of thing being promoted. And they're trying to create what they call the fourth industrial revolution. But they don't have the capital. And these companies don't want to invest in genuine changes to the environment or changes to their industries that will reduce dangers to the ecology of the planet. And so what they're doing is they're trying to find ways to get revenue out of manipulating popular sentiment around climate change and around environmental pollution and so on. And so it appears, so if you look in this article here, it's an article from the Atlantic Council, and there's a lot of the US government organizations involved, particular focused around what Al Gore has been promoting for many years. And if you look at this, it says Climate Finance Partnership, mobilizing institutional capital to address the climate opportunity. So it's not about dangers, it's about the opportunity out of climate change. And so what it says here is that there's vast amounts of capital locked up, which in institutions, that means in pension funds basically, and there's calculated that there's $100 trillion locked up in pension funds. That means the pensions paid by all the workers in the shops, all the workers in the world, particularly in the Western world, the United States, Britain and so on, their pension funds are locked up in these institutions. So what they're saying is, by creating a state of mind within the population, that there is a desperate and urgent crisis, that we need immediate action, a World War II type mobilization, or a New Deal like Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced in the 1930s to end the Great Depression. We need the biggest mobilization of resources in the history of mankind. And so they have grassroots movements mobilized by campaigns that they institute, and this is one of the campaigns that have been instituted called Extinction Rebellion. It came about last August, it was created. And this, so the people who come along are genuine, but behind it stand powerful business interests. Now, when I read an article by, wasn't it called, I'll find it in a minute. When I read an article yesterday looking into this question, or day before yesterday, they were saying, that these pension fund institutions and big banks and so on are behind it. Well, you think, well, can that really be an orchestrated campaign, like a sort of coup d'etat scenario like they're doing in Venezuela, where one thing happens, like, for example, Guaido goes on the streets, declares himself president, has a demonstration, suddenly, out of the blue, Donald Trump supports him, suddenly, out of the blue, the European Union supports, Britain supports, and so on, the Lima group of countries support. So there's an orchestrated series of events, like a media campaign, pre-programmed, pre-planned, strategic operation to change the mind of the population around an issue. And then to get the population saying, we want change, we want change. And then along comes, you look in the newspapers today and yesterday, the BBC reported yesterday, one of the directors of Legal & General, which holds £1 trillion of pension funds in Britain, your money and the population's money in their pensions, they suddenly said there's a desperate emergency and we must do something about it. Then the Bank of England and the Bank of France, the head of the Bank of England, was his Mark Carey or something like that, he said today, he released a statement with the head of the Bank of France saying that they must urgently act on climate change. So here you have people at the centre, and they've got something like 15.3 trillion in funds that they're planning to get released. And so next year there's a meeting in Beijing where it is planned to raise this question, how to unlock the 100 billion, or better said 90 billion of the 100 billion to be used, your money to be used to promote the fourth industrial revolution. That means the interests of the big companies, Microsoft and all these giant companies, IKEA, Goldman Sachs and so on, how you would release these funds from the population to fund an expansion of their economic activity, because they're not prepared to fund it themselves, because they're not making enough profits themselves. So they need the government to finance and the people to finance their profitable expansion in the name of fighting climate change. Whereas in actual fact, most of these people, like someone like Al Gore says he's climate neutral, because when he flies around the world in jets, he also pays something for a couple of trees. And therefore, he says his carbon footprint is zero. And the other thing they want to do, which is well documented, particularly the World Wildlife Fund being involved in this, is what they call financialisation of nature. And so that means, for example, the privatisation of jungles, natural forests, and so on, in order to say, well, this is a natural resource. If we can if we can say it's worth this much money, then we can create a global trade in the utilisation of nature. And again, it's this type of bubble type of economic activity that they engaged in before the great crash with derivatives derived from mortgages in the past. Now they want to do that with nature. So that's the sort of background that I believe explains what this protest is about. Now, you only have to ask yourself, if there were it's about 500 people there. If there were 500 young black kids protesting against someone being killed by the police, or if there were, trade unionists protesting, demonstrating, if the workers in Primark came out on strike and demonstrated, they would not be allowed to occupy Marble Arch and Oxford Circus and London and Waterloo Bridge, for days on end without being stopped by the police. Now, the climate protesters they've declared, a lot of them, they're prepared to get arrested. Well, they get arrested and charged with a minor offence and then go to, so that creates good publicity as well. So they're being used, their goodwill is being used as cannon fodder to promote this agenda. And that's why, the most shocking thing for me to realise how exactly this is interconnected. This writer, Corey Morningstar, her name is, I was asking this morning, why is it an organised campaign such that A, B, C, D, E happens? And it really does appear like that, because the way in which the big banks and big institutions have responded in the last couple of days. Let me just try and find something here. It says here, it's been impossible to attend any serious climate change conference over the past decade that hasn't included a significant and ever-increasing focus on the topic of private capital mobilisation. Institutional capital, more specifically. And it says, why? There are two main reasons. One, driven by the enormity and immediacy of the challenge, and the other, the scale of the opportunity. And so the scale of the opportunity is the key thing. And then it says here, a bit further on, a detailed analysis by the World Bank found that while 100 trillion is held by pension funds and other institutional investors, these same investors allocate less than 2 trillion over a 25-year period to the infrastructure investment in emerging markets. And the fraction of that investment that could be considered green, clean or climate friendly was negligible. So turning that around is the real objective behind really the campaigns that are taking place at the moment. Behind the scenes, this is what's going on. Yeah, what's your name?
Sue.
And what are you doing here? What's this?
I'm like everybody else. I'm a volunteer here. I'm doing press liaison.
Okay. What does that entail?
Just being here and helping the press find useful for people for them to interview, giving them background information, making sure they're on our press list for future days that they might want to cover something.
Okay. And how long have you been involved in Extinction Rebellion and perhaps in the wider movement for campaigning about climate issues and ecological issues and so on?
I've been involved in the environmental movement for a long time, like maybe 30 years, and worked in communications in particular, and I had it as a personal passion because it just seems a very serious issue. And I actually only found out about Extinction Rebellion relatively recently. And somebody had organised a local meeting where I live, and about, 80 people came. I don't know how they came, but they came to a local community centre. And I was one of them, and that was only about 2 months ago. And it is such an amazing movement because it has spread like wildfire. I've never seen, if you paid an environmental organisation to set up something as massive as this, that closes the streets in 4 locations in London, gets people camping in all those locations, gets people volunteering, gets people giving up their day jobs for weeks or months on end for free, and doing all that work just out of their own commitment. If you had to organise that as a professional organisation, it would cost millions, and you'd say, it's not possible, not in that time frame. But people are so worried about climate change that they're here, and they're willing to get arrested, a lot of them, and they're willing to spend all their time here and do amazing things.
Okay, now I've read that there is, like, within the climate campaigning movement, many of the NGOs are actually quite flush with money in their campaigning activities and so on. I mean, historically, lots of organisations that are NGOs have got lots of money, but they're also, I've been reading recently, in particular this article by Corey Morningstar, who's claiming that Greta Thunberg has been manipulated by quite powerful economic interests to try and serve their agenda. Greta Thunberg.
I've got no idea. I'd be very surprised, but Extinction Rebellion is entirely volunteer-led. There may be people who work for NGOs in their day job, but it is not funded like all those big NGOs that you're talking about. It is entirely volunteer-led.
Well, I mean, it could be, though, that you've got, even though you've not got a direct, let's say you've not got a direct, someone's paying this person to do something, once you've got the circumstances and the environment, the ambient within these organisations to promote a specific set of agenda, then organising a protest is not that difficult.
I don't really know what you're talking about, I'm afraid. I mean, we have a very serious task ahead to save our children's lives. There are highly respected environmental scientists around the world who agree and have published and have spoken out on the fact that climate change is an emergency. We cannot ignore it any longer.
But for example, the slogans that you've got there, zero carbon net carbon by 2025, that no one's seriously proposing that that's possible. At least not within the particular structure of power that we live in.
We have to.
So there's a disjoint between the argument that science proves that climate change is happening and the argument zero carbon emissions by 2025.
No. If you were standing in the street and a car was zooming down the street to kill you and it was going really fast, you'd run out the way.
So you're saying we have to be saved. We have to be saved immediately.
You wouldn't say, "Oh, I don't know if I've got enough time to get out of the way of that car." You'd just, run. And that's all we're doing. We're saying, this is the facts. It's a climate emergency. The only way to get out of this climate emergency is to get to zero carbon by 2025. The scientists have said we've got 11 or 12 years before which we go past the tipping point, and that will be the end of our children's lives in the world as we know it.
But it's not the first time people have talked about the final tipping point, is it?
This final tipping point has been discussed for many years.
When I was a kid, yeah, when I was a kid that was being discussed.
And everybody's ignored it, and that's why people are here, to say we can't ignore it anymore.
Right, okay, but I've got an article here from that's discussing, this is big finance, and they're talking about what they can do to help campaign against climate change, and they're talking about basically monetising the campaigns against climate change. So this is from the Atlantic Council, and they're talking about a World Bank report where there's 100 trillion stashed away that they want to get access to, and apparently next year in Beijing there's a conference where they're discussing how to unlock this 100 trillion in pension funds and use it for fourth generation revolution, fourth industrial revolution they call it.
I think you have to talk to those corporations. I've got no idea what they're doing. Of course, big companies are constantly greening themselves, becoming, co-opting the language of environmentalism for their own purposes. I've got no idea what that company does. And some companies are genuine and they are part of environmental technological movement to reduce carbon. And some companies will look at how to make a profit from that. But it's none of that. I'm not here to. I can't possibly comment on that. I'm just a mom and somebody who's been very conscious of the climate change threat over my lifetime and how so little action has been taken on it by governments, despite increasing and persistent proof that it is happening. And I'm really scared for my children.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, I'm not trying to denigrate any of your action in coming out and demonstrating or protesting. I've spent my whole life protesting in one cause or another. But, for example, this morning, I mean, I'm trying to point out to you the interconnections between certain big interests, like you're saying, which green themselves, which previously were never green. Like I said to the guy earlier on, Pret a Manger was once owned by Coca-Cola. They greened themselves. Now they've got green, vegetarian, Pret a Manger, you name it. But Pret a Manger, if you actually investigate, it's not a green company at all.
Okay, so one of the demands of Extinction Rebellion, so there's three demands. One is that governments and the media tell the truth about the climate crisis, the climate emergency. That's not been done so far. The second thing is that we get to zero carbon. We put in place policies that allow such dramatic change that we can reach zero carbon by 2025.
Where would the finance for that come from?
And the third point is that a citizens' assembly should be put together, which is outside of politics. Because if you put the onus on the government that is currently in power, obviously they're not going to be in power in 5 years' time or however many years' time. And they're always scared of the voter and making things uncomfortable for the voter. So there has to be a much bigger, broader assembly of people who look at the research, who look at what has to be done in that time frame and put forward the policies, which the government then has to implement.
Okay, let me put it to you this way. If what you're saying is, and I understand what you're saying, if the Bank of England, as they did this morning, the Bank of France, as they did this morning, Legal in General, as they did yesterday, and other major multinational banking institutions that have got your pension fund in their hands, but they're not allowed to spend it, and then they say, because of the climate emergency, we need to be able to spend your pension fund. We look after it very nicely for you, but we need to spend it on the technologies that we say are necessary and our scientists say are necessary, like, for example, carbon capture devices that nobody knows if they're going to work on scale. But we need to spend, let's say, 50 trillion of your pension funds, the American pension funds and so on this, because there's such an emergency. We fully agree with you. And while we're making profit out of it, well, so be it. What would you say to that?
This is why we want a citizens' assembly. There are many, many very difficult issues about how we're going to get where we need to get. I can't possibly answer that question. I'm not qualified to do it. And very few people will have that background knowledge. I can't answer that question. But if you put together a citizens' assembly where you have a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives and the capability of analysing things and deciding how to go forward, that's what we're proposing. I have no...
For me, I've been arguing for a constituent assembly. That means an elected body, recallable to the people, to decide the fate of Britain, because I think we're in a desperate crisis. But a citizens' assembly, my problem with that is that they're open to pressure from big interests. So if you've got loads of wealthy people, like Belinda Gates comes in the room, anyone who's on the Citizens' Assembly, they'll probably have it televised, and so everyone will get known who they are. They put them on telly, they start talking about it. Then they become celebrities. And then suddenly you've got a whole culture of, let's say, 100 people who've been selected for the Citizens' Assembly, who made a good speech there, and suddenly they've been invited all over the place, travel around the world, like Greta Thunberg. And so no longer is she Greta Thunberg or a school student of 16. Suddenly she's a world famous pop. She's going to be a pop star her whole life. We know that.
Well,
we can't deny that.
We can preempt and predict the problems and drive ourselves mad. all we can say, we are in a crisis and something has to be done about it, and that's all we're doing here. We want the government and the media to accept and to tell the truth that we are in an emergency. And where we go from there, I don't know, but we have to work it out. We have to work it out.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Cheers. What's your name? What are you doing here?
My name's Kathy, and I've come down to join Extinction Rebellion for the day because it's such an important movement and such an important problem that we're all facing now around the world, the problem of climate change.
Why do you think this movement is particularly important? Why this one, not previous ones?
Well, I don't think there are any others particularly, not on such a large scale. So it's only fairly recently, a few months ago, that it became apparent that there is a massive difference in 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming. This was presented by the International Panel on Climate Change last November, which is a panel of scientists who've produced this report, and the number of significant weather events around the world, such as flooding or droughts and hurricanes, there's a massive difference in the incidence of that between the 1.5 degrees and the 2 degrees. We're already at 1.1 degrees of warming, I think, and the Paris Agreement, I believe, was to try and limit it to 2 degrees, but we're at the moment on a business as usual policy. We're heading to go well beyond that, so warming will be well in excess of 2 degrees.
Are you comfortable with the use of the 12 years left type slogan, sort of millenarian type methodology? Are you comfortable with that?
Well, I just think it means that we have urgency. Time is literally running out. That's what this symbol is. We've got to act right away. We have to convince governments around the world to act now. And so the XR has 3 aims. One is for the government to start telling the truth about climate change. Secondly, it's to start initiating policies that are going to create a carbon zero Britain or other countries by 2025. In other words, we have to do this right away. And the third thing is for a citizens' assembly to be set up to oversee all of these changes, to make sure that they are implemented appropriately and quickly and fairly, and to make sure that no groups are disadvantaged in this process.
Okay, if you've got as acute an emergency as you're describing, which I'm not disputing, I'm just posing the issue, doesn't that, or if, for example, as I'm going to suggest to you, next year in Beijing, a proposal is made that major financial institutions can gain access to $90 trillion of pension funds because of the emergency, that they'll spend your pension fund on fourth generation industrialization programs that they claim will end climate change. What would you say to that? Do you think that is there a grassroots method as opposed to a method that involves major institutions that already exist carrying out their agenda? Is it the same thing?
I don't know. You've lost me there on all of that.
If there's an emergency, you need to act. If someone turns around, like the Bank of England turned around today and said, we must act, would you believe the governor of the Bank of England is actually going to act in the same way as you'd like to act?
Well, I think that's what the Citizens' Assembly idea is all about. Because obviously, we've been waiting for many, many years for the politicians to do something about climate change, and it's not happening. So I think it's over to the people, and that's why so many people have come out today.
Why a citizens' assembly as opposed to a constituent assembly? If you know what a constituent assembly is. Constituent assembly is an elected body of the people, recallable perhaps to the people to decide.
I think because it's got to be representative of all groups in society so that nobody is unfairly disadvantaged. I think that's the basic ethos.
So on the model of the of the abortion issue in Ireland, for example, last year?
I don't think I want to talk about any other issues.
No, I'm saying that's the Citizens Assembly model. I'm
Right.
saying that was they had a Citizens Assembly in Ireland before that.
I don't know anything about that, I'm afraid. Yeah. But we do need to think about other groups in society, not just ourselves. And actually, I think that's a big part of the XR movement. People have become very selfish, and it's about how much money can I make out of this, what's in it for me. And we shouldn't think like that. We need to be much more careful and caring and considerate to not just plants and animals, but other people as well. And so we do need to be careful about some countries in the world which might be disadvantaged by moving to a carbon neutral scenario. So, for example, there are some countries that are very, very sunny, but happen to be very, very tiny. So if you take away their oil, they're not able to produce enough energy on their own. So I think there's got to be a lot more distribution and sharing of the new technologies and resources.
And the ownership? What about the ownership issues?
Ownership of what?
Ownership of the technologies that are spent. If you're going to spend a lot of money on technologies to cure, if you're going to spend lots of money on technology to resolve an immediate issue, who's going to get that money?
Look, I'm not an expert in this area. I'm just a middle-aged mother and a doctor from Cheshire who's come down here because I believe that this is a crisis and I haven't got all the answers.
Do you believe that money should be public or should be private?
I don't know. That's not a decision that I can make. I don't know. I don't understand all that. I'm not a financial person. I'm a doctor. I understand.
Are you an NHS doctor or a private doctor?
NHS. Yes. 100%. Yeah.
So the principal is involved in that as well. You see what I mean?
Yeah. Okay.
Who does something and why?
Pardon?
I'm saying who does something and why. That's.
Yeah. I think we need to be all a bit more altruistic and think more about our actions and how they affect other people.
What was your name again?
Kathy.
Thanks ever so much.
Thank you.
What's your name, mate? What are you doing here?
My name's Anthony, I'm also known as Colonel Ananta, Kernel Ananta. I'm an MC. I'm also a light worker, someone who's here to raise the vibrational frequency of humanity through using the heart.
Okay, how'd you go about doing that?
Basically by being in tune with who I really am. I've been meditating for 10 years and come to realise that I am an energetic being, a soul in physicality, basically.
Well, that's fair enough, isn't it?
Yeah.
What are you doing on the protest?
Yeah, what I'm doing here is to shine that light. You can see behind you, it's just incredible. Like, the system says, work, work, work. People say, I don't want to work, I want to be free. So I'm here to help that happen. But there is a deeper meaning behind what's actually going on with Extinction Rebellion, as you're probably aware. You want me to explain?
Which is?
Yeah, so as I understand it, because I don't understand anything, I'm understanding. My understanding and realization of why I'm here is because scientists have said that the planet has 15 years before we become extinct.
Do you believe that?
Yes.
How old are you?
So I was going to say I believe that it could happen if we don't react, but because we are now reacting because of this movement, because of this rebellion, it won't happen.
But don't you remember previous times when they've said so many years, you know? Don't you remember that?
Yeah. Since I'm 40 years old, since I can remember.
You've had a couple of impenetrable passes.
Yeah. Cameron, Blair, all these people.
Millennium Bug.
They don't have an interest in human beings. I could go deeper on what I believe.
Okay.
Reptilian theory, all this stuff. It's not a conspiracy for me.
Reptilian.
Yeah. I've had two people in my life, my best friend's wife's grandfather saw two 7-foot reptilian humanoid beings in the Mexican jungle, and there's another not so savoury event which I won't disclose here. And my own experiences, my own awakening. I know what's real in my heart. But none of that matters anymore because they've tried to control the masses through fear. It's worked, but now it can't because the frequency of the planet and all the beings on it are awakening to love. and love cannot be stopped. It's the only truth.
Okay, thanks very much, mate.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
It all started in October last year, and it's absolutely amazing how it's grown. It's developed, it's grown like a mushroom, you know, just it popped up overnight, and it's drawn so many people. The first action was in November when we took the bridges across the Thames, 5 bridges, and held them for a day on a Sunday, and that was dramatic. But this is just extraordinary. We've held 5 places in central London for 3 days now, in spite of 250 arrests, something like that. And we are continuing to hold these spaces. And we've got a lot of backing. You can see that the whole of Oxford Street is empty of cars, and people are so enjoying it. The tourists and the people who come here to shop are having a lovely time. So this, as far as I'm concerned, is how we make a better world together.
So who are the people that are responsible for putting the organisation together?
Hang on. How can I explain? It's a whole. It started with a smallish group of people, but it's the way we need to organise things in the future is very democratically. So it's just one group of people who've then spread. We are now from a group out in a long way away on the borders of Wales. We just popped up again like a mushroom only a few weeks ago, and now we've got 25 members. So it's like an organic kind of spreading. There isn't one leader. There aren't even several leaders. We're all equal.
So you're not a founding member yourself?
No. I've really only joined. I joined in the bridge, but then I've joined in the local group that only started a few weeks ago. Cheers.
Content over everything from your melody. Man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV. Listen.